Okay, now down to the actual build. First thing I'm going to look at is our carbon bird motors and our carbon bird motor mounts, and of course the various booms that are available. Alright, so I'm going to do the arms basically first as a module. Now the arms go together pretty much the same way no matter what build you do, with the exception of one thing, and that is this. This is an insert that you use on the metal booms. It comes as an option on some kits. You have to use them on the Y6 kit, and it's a slightly different, larger design for the Y6. But they come as two pieces. You have to insert them and run some CA glue down the joins. Clearly done, covered in the instructions, and nothing really tricky about getting this particular mount together. But one thing I will say on them is I like to just file the edges of these off after I've glued them, because what you want them to do is slide into the end of your metal boom firmly so they don't move around, but you do want them to be able to be pulled out and removed easily. They don't actually hold the motor into the boom or anything, the actual motor mount does that, but what they do is they add some strength to this last bit. They also add a bit of rigidity around that end so that when you do clamp the actual motor mount, or heatsink as they're often referred to in the manual, when you do actually clamp that on, it does actually have a bit more rigidity in the metal tubing for that to clamp onto. If you find you've got something like a metal armour, these are a really handy upgrade because they'll actually stop you bending the heat sinks during crashes. Alright, so just want to get them out of the way first. I'm not going to talk too much about them really. If you're using carbon booms, you don't actually use them. They won't actually fit. There is a size available to go into carbon booms for the Y6 specifically, because you have to use it for the Y6. But other than that, you wouldn't use them on carbon booms. Alright, so fitting the motors is really actually quite simple. There is the odd trick. We have our motor heat sink, and the saddle that goes with it. We have a boom, and I'm going to show you how to use the carbon insert on a metal boom here as my example, but you don't have to do it. Now, first thing you need to do when you're using the carbon items, the carbon pieces, is you have to lay the wires around one of the splines, and the instructions show you to put two on one side and one on the other, and you have to hold them and sit them in those grooves while this gets inserted. If you don't do that, you won't get the wires into the boom. Alright, so that's all I'm going to really cover with this. You need to make sure that you get the wires sitting either side, one on one side, two on the other, with the carbon piece. If this was a Y6, I'd have another motor on this side, and I'd have to do the same thing with the wires on that side. So, not going to talk about that anymore. Putting it together. So I'm going to use the carbon boom. Now the first thing I like to do is take the saddle and the heatsink, line them up, and just loosely put my two M3 screws into the saddle and just get the threads started. So they're still loose, but they're one piece. Okay, now these are metal screws going into metal, so you really need to use your Loctite. This is medium Loctite, 243 blue stuff. You need to use that on every single metal screw that goes into a metal part. If you don't, it will vibrate off in flight and you will crash. It is simple as that. You must use Loctite on all metal screws into metal. For the purpose of these videos, I'm not going to bother, But if you see a metal screw going into metal, assume, unless I say otherwise, that I had put Loctite on it. Alright. So, with those saddles nice and loose, I can just slide that straight over the end of the boom. And I tend to just pinch it tight myself. Now, with the carbon booms, what I like to do is this semicircle forms a really nice stop point for the carbon, for the boom itself. So you can actually slide the boom up, and if you do it gently, you get to a point where it won't go anymore. It just meets that, and that's where I like to just snug the booms up. So you get a little bit of extra carbon beyond the saddle, rather than trying to crush the end. And then we just tighten up those screws. Now you want to get them just snugged up a little, and then when you go to tighten the screws up, what you want to do is watch these two gaps. You want to keep them equal as you tighten up. So I'm going to just do each screw a bit, have a look. You can see there, those two gaps are pretty much even. Alright, and just a little snug up on each screw. You don't want to over tighten these. You don't want to crush the boom, but you certainly want it to be solid. Okay, so next thing you need to do, and this will depend on whether you're top mounting or bottom mounting the motor. This motor is currently set up as bottom mount. If you look at this particular boom here, you can see that's a bottom mount motor, but either way, that's your mounting plate goes towards the lower section, or the flat underside of the heatsink. So the plate always goes to the flat underside. Alright, whether you're doing it as a bottom mount motor, or in this case as a top mount motor, the base of the motor goes to the under flat side of the heatsink. Now, to make it easier to thread the wires through the boom, I usually just grab a piece of normal everyday sticky tape and just wrap it around those connectors, and that lets me really easily feed the wire through the boom. And this being a 300mm boom, you only really just end up with just enough wire hanging out the other end. In fact, this being the smaller motor, the leads are actually slightly shorter. So, and then what you do is you invert it, look for the screw holes that line up with the bottom of the plate, and using my short M3 bolts and Loctite, put 2 bolts through the heatsink and into the motor. And again, snug them up. Don't want to do it over tight. You're putting Loctite on these screws, so they will actually, Loctite will actually hold it. You don't have to really seriously crank the screws when you're using Loctite. It's a mistake a lot of people make. You just want to make sure it's firm, and then you let the Loctite hold the screw in place. So that as such is an arm build. Pretty simple process, but there are a couple of tips and tricks. Alright, so lay that one aside. Tip number 1, if this happens to be a pivoting boom on, say, a tricopter, before you put the motor on, I always recommend you fit the 2 ball bearings, and I'll actually come back to this on another video and do the pivot mount in detail, but just be aware that it's a handy thing to fit the ball bearings first and get the spacing on them right, and the actual pivot arm, the control arm that connects to the servo, you want to insert that onto the boom before you then fit the motor mount. You won't be able to get that piece on once the motor mount's on, and you don't really want to mess with these bearings too much. Taking them on and off too many times will actually destroy the bearings. So just a little tip there, make sure you put that on before you do that. Now, this is a motor and an arm, a short arm. This is a little 160mm arm. Now, as you can see, we've got a bit of an issue here in that we've got lots of wire hanging out the end of that boom. Alright, now that's just going to give you a serious mess that you need to somehow make go away inside the centre section of the multi-copter. And that, frankly, is a pain in the butt. So, how you get around that is to S-bend the wire. So I've got another motor here which is already attached to a mount. Right. Now I don't want all that wire to be hanging out the end of the boom. So what I can do is I can do an S, which is make a loop and squash it. Right. To actually effectively shorten up the wire. You can see now I'm only going to end up, if I add a boom here, with only about 5 centimetres of wire hanging outside. That's probably enough when it comes to this. A bit shorter might be good, but that's good size. What you then do with this little bundle of wire, because what do you now do with this? You can put a bit of tape around it if you want. What I prefer is to actually put a little bit of heat shrink tubing over that and actually shrink that down so it's a little bit more stable. Like I said, you can do it with tape. Problem I have with tape on things like this is that with heat, with time, with everything else, the glue on the tape will get all gooey, and there's nothing worse than when you've got to pull one of these things apart and you have all this sticky gooiness on your wires, and it gets on your fingers, it gets on your tools, it gets on your clothes, and it's just yuck. Heat shrink tubing, nice little piece, just over the centre section. You only need like a centimetre long piece just to hold that S in place, and that will hold it together, not get messy later, and means that you don't end up with a whole bunch of cable sitting out the end of your boom. I'm actually going to go ahead and assemble this and come back. So there you have it done. So I've heat shrunk that S-bend and reinserted the cable and the motor mount through the boom, and as you can see I've just got a manageable now piece of wire hanging out the end here, as opposed to this whole mess that I would have to deal with as part of the central structure. Believe me, when we get down to doing the wiring in the centre section of the airframe itself, the less wire you have to deal with at that point, the happier you're going to be, because there's already going to be way too much wiring in there to deal with. So there we have a boom without the shortened leads and a boom with. So, and this boom has got bearings on it as a rear boom for a tricopter. If you're doing a gimbal, that all works the same way. And I'm going to come back and do a separate video just on the pivot mount. The next video I'm going to do, I'm going to start looking at how we put the centre frame together. Okay, and how the boom blocks and everything go on. And we won't actually come back to our booms and our motors until we actually fit them to the centre section. So that's all for now. As you can see, it's quite a simple thing to do.